Good afternoon, everyone. This is Richard Greenberg, President of the Los Angeles chapter of OWASP. Very pleased to have a very special guest with us today who's going to talk about the future of asset discovery. Before he joins us, I wanted to just share a little bit about OWASP LA. You know, who are we? So we've got more than 2,000 meetup members now. We passed that threshold a few weeks ago. We're one of the original host chapters of AppSec California, possibly the best conference you'll ever go to once we can start resuming in physical meetings. Great community with great peer networking here. We typically would meet monthly, about 70 to 90 of us on the fourth Wednesday of each month. We've now turned those into virtual meetings, obviously, and we've got world-class speakers on a variety of different topics. Here's our board. I want to tip my hat to these great volunteers. Lots of hours to bring you the conference, bring you the meetings. Just want to thank each of them for what they've done, taking the time out of their busy lives, giving back to the community. That's what it's all about. We're very fortunate to have Clint Gibler with us next month. Those of you know Clint know he's a top-notch speaker. He'll be talking about detect complex code patterns using semantic grep. And you'll be getting a meetup notice about that if you're signed up with us. If not, just take a look at Meetup and OWASP Los Angeles, and you can sign up to hear what Clint's got to share with us. And that's, again, always the fourth Wednesday at 11:45 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Here are other social media presences. We would like you to, join the conversation, give us some feedback, but also feel free to post anything you feel is related to software security, or even in a broader perspective, IoT, anything. And the conversations can get pretty good, a lot of good information. We are on all of these platforms, and I hope you can connect with us. And if you're a vendor watching us and would like to potentially meet a lot of people, and you get a little, social media presence for you and meet the community, reach out to us. We're on Eventbrite. You can sign up or just look for us and send us a meetup message. We'd be very happy to work with you. And, we understand the importance of the various companies out there helping people with their solutions. And we are very pleased to have a long list of sponsors in the past. So feel free to reach out. As you're stuck at home, you can catch up. If you didn't go to AppSec California and see some great talks that we've recorded, we spent a fair amount of time and effort building our repository on YouTube of great videos of the talks. And one thing about AppSec California, there were 4 tracks. So you only saw a quarter of the tracks, even if you attended. So you can catch up, look for us, do a search for AppSec Cali 2020, and you'll be able to see some really great talk. That's one of the things that distinguishes that conference. The talks are just the best you'll see in the world. Without further ado, I would like to bring our speaker to the forefront today. Jeremiah and I think we know each other over 10 years. It's been a pleasure. We've had some good conversations on a variety of different subjects. Those of you who don't know Jeremiah, he's the founder and CEO of Bit Discovery. He's the chief of security strategy at SentinelOne. He's a professional hacker. He's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but he's such a nice guy. Really, don't be afraid of him. He's also the founder of White Hat Security. And I think many of you first met Jeremiah when he was doing that. So Jeremiah, the screen is yours, my friend. Very happy to have you, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's always great to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and share a little bit more about what I know. We're to talk a lot about asset inventory. Richard did a good job of sharing my background. I'll just leave that up in the screen. But I've been in information security for about 20 years now. I was part of the application security industry as long as there was an industry. And founding White Hat was to find vulnerabilities in websites that scale. And the whole idea of vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment, is to find the vulnerabilities and get them fixed before the bad guys find them and exploit them. It's a really simple concept when you break it down. And a long, long time ago, we knew websites had vulnerabilities, but we didn't know a lot about the statistics with it. Our industry was filled with a lot of, mythology on what issues were actually out there. So when we started finding vulnerabilities at scale at White Hat developed our statistics report, which was the first of its kind. What vulnerabilities are actually out there, the types, the kinds, the likelihood, the time to fix, the remediation rates, and the whole industry advanced as a result. We need to make data-driven decisions. So after I spent 15, 16, 17 years doing website vulnerability assessment, one of the things that comes up when you're in that space, and many of you that are listening to me now find this problem, that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations really don't know what it is that they own on the internet. They don't have a list of their websites, let alone prioritize. They don't know what IoT devices, DNS servers, anything and everything, right? So the adversary, those we're up against, because we're not just finding and fixing vulnerabilities as an academic exercise. We want to keep someone out of the system. So we need to have a really good idea of what they're going to attack. So to speak, we need to know what our attack surface is. And that's the very first step of any information security program. And it's just so happens to be, it's the one thing most companies are not very good at. So when we were working at White Hat and customers would say, I want you to scan all of our websites, we're like, great, give us the list. And they really couldn't give us the list. So we had to set out to try to help them build that inventory. And deceptive as it sounds, helping an organization create an inventory of their websites or everything that they have internet facing is really hard, deceptively hard. It's probably the most technically challenging problem I've ever attempted to solve in the industry. So when I left White Hat, it was to solve that one problem. If I was to move on from the industry, do something else after vulnerability assessment, it was to help solve the asset inventory problem. That's why I'm doing doing bit discovery. And I was fortunate enough, I reached out to a couple of experts and I asked them, what are their thoughts on asset inventory? And I got some great quotes from industry leaders, from some of the luminaries out there, those that I look up to. And it turns out that asset inventory is part and parcel really important to vulnerability management. If you have 100 assets, 100 websites, and you're just finding vulnerabilities in one of them, you really didn't do a pen test or vulnerability assessment, really, because you left out 99% of everything else. Asset inventory becomes important in mergers and acquisitions. If we're security practitioners, the businesses that we're protecting are going to acquire or partner with other third parties, and all of a sudden their environment, we're now responsible for. So it becomes very important to the business for asset inventory to be there during an M&A process. A third use case for asset inventory is also cyber insurance. You want to make sure you're getting insured on all your assets, and the carrier is going to want to know what you look like from the outside to make sure that they price your risk appropriately. So there's many use cases and many important factors that go into asset inventory, which is again why I'm looking at it. What we're going to cover today is asset inventory from a global level, and I'll get into the details, but it'd be really the first time anybody has looked at the inventory of the internet with an idea of ownership. If we looked at the major gaming companies, the major banks, the major healthcare operators, and figured out all the things that they own, what can we learn from that? Now, there's plenty of internet telemetry out there, so we know like how many nodes or how many assets are on the internet and generally what they're running. But there's never been grouped in terms of ownership. What companies own what assets and what do they look like, let's say relative to each other? And that's what we're going to look at. It's going to be a very data-driven look at asset inventory. Now, one of the stories that I like to tell, that when you ask people about this history, you've heard the story of Equifax 1,000 times. You probably heard the story that Equifax got hacked due to a vulnerability that they didn't patch, but should have patched because it was more or less well known. But that's the easy part of the story. When you actually look at the actual complaints, the Federal Trade Commission versus Equifax, you find this one really interesting detail. Equifax actually was patching this vulnerability on many of their other websites, just not the one that got hacked. And if you read close, they only didn't patch that issue on that one website is because they didn't know they owned that website. They didn't have a good asset inventory or an all-encompassing vulnerability management program that covered everything. If they were truly scanning everything, they probably wouldn't have been compromised and we wouldn't have this story. So this is the story of Equifax. This is the story of asset inventory and why it's so important to me that everybody really figures out what it is that they own, because we can prevent this problem. It's not that hard. We know how to find and fix these vulnerabilities. We just have to find where they are in the actual websites. So as we get into this data is live as of May 2020. This is all data that BitDiscovery has collected across the internet. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to start to dive into some of the terminology and how we do this data collection, because if I don't do that, you won't understand the metrics. When I use the term asset, it's kind of a general catch-all. You might say host name, you might say node, you might say system. I like the term asset, and the very simple definition is it's a domain, subdomain, and/or an IP address combination for anything, any device connected to the internet. So from me or you, from wherever you're sitting connected to the internet, if you can reach out and touch something, a host name or an IP address, that is an asset. These could be web servers, name servers, IoT devices, network printers, and the list goes down the range. I find asset is probably the best definition in this context we can come up with, so that's what we'll be using. BitDiscovery does two things. One is it scours the internet trying to find anything and everything connected to the internet, not just by IP, but also by domain name and host name. If you cannot find the entirety of the internet or the web just by IP addresses, you have to have a body of DNS information as well. So when you count up all the assets that we've ever seen on the internet that's in our database, it's roughly 4.5 billion. We believe it's the largest and most complete repository of data of its kind. So not only are we collecting as much data about the internet as possible, we also have data relationships with several hundred other third parties. So every time we scour the internet, we have 200 or so internet snapshots. It's almost like a copy of the internet from our perspective. About 550 data sources that give us who-is information, DNS information, port scanning information. We're not purists about it. We want as much data about the internet in one spot as possible. Now, when you get into one particular asset, how much data do we have about any one particular asset? Let's say a column of data might be an open port number. Is it running Apache? What geolocation is it in? Is it running WordPress? It's roughly 115 different potential columns of data to varying degrees, depending on how much we know about that particular asset. And that becomes very useful. So we know an asset is there, but we want to know its full technology stack as much as we can about it. When you do this kind of work, you end up with a genuine big data problem. We have 4 different kind of compute restraints. We have disk, because we're saving all this data. We have memory and CPU to crunch all this data, and we have IO. So we have about 150 years of just CPU compute time managing all this data. So it's a large problem. Part of it we host, we co-locate it ourselves because we have to run, very high-speed processors on this data, and part of it's in the cloud for scale and operation. So that is our data set. It is absolutely enormous, and it grows by the hour. All right. How do we go about finding an asset inventory of one particular company? Now, I'm not going to go through each and every one of these particular bullet points. There is some dirt or ambiguity in the data, and you can read this later. But let me give you one example. Let's say you're working on a banking website or a retailer. They're going to give you their primary domain name. That domain name is registered to an email address at that company. Let's say dns@domain.com. We will then look for every other domain name in WHOIS registered to the exact same email address, because that is a high probability that all those domain names and all those host names underneath that are owned by the same company. So that would be one technique. that we'll use out of about 12 to get an idea of ownership over a company. Other aspects might be, are they on the same range of IP addresses? Are they neighbors? Do they have the same ARIN information? And about a dozen other factors. Now, there's many things that get in the way of making this accurate. Could be round robin DNS, the any lookups in DNS. The DNS server may not respond in a timely fashion. And there's other issues that might give us a few percentage points of error in either direction. For instance, anything under star.company.com, they probably own. But if they have an asset, let's say on company.wpengine or company.salesforce.com, we wouldn't easily capture that as theirs because it's kind of an asset that somebody else owns. So those would be a little out of scope. So we do the best we can with drawing a circle around all the inventory one organization owns. So what we do is, in this data, we look at the top companies in each particular industry. Let's say the top 10 US-based companies in each of the verticals we're going to look at. We did a complete inventory that's fairly accurate on each company, and we started crunching the numbers. So with that, we're going to start looking at the data analysis and figure out what the data is actually telling us. So where we're going to start is total assets. This is the median number of assets globally across major industries. So the way to read this is, if you look at a top 10 US automaker, they have about 19,603 total assets that are externally accessible. This would be your Ford and your GMs and things like that. So again, what is an asset? Host name, foo.gm.com with an IP address. That is one asset. Banking will have about 16,000, education about 142,000, and so on down the range. Now you can see different top organizations in each vertical have a wide varying degrees of a median number of assets. Here's where it gets interesting and where we start to push the boundaries of knowledge when it comes to our understanding about the internet and where things are headed. We know what is going on out there, but we only can guess. We might have educated guesses on, say, why does the education industry, why do the top 10 public universities have way more internet connected assets than a top 10 retailer? So why is that? So we can start, having some theories around this that we might be able to prove or disprove later. So in the case of education and technology, they have by far the most standout number of total median number of assets. We think this is because when students go on campus, campuses and universities have a policy of being wide open in terms of projects they allow their students. It's a wide open network for the pursuit of knowledge. So they'll deploy new websites, new systems, new servers, and it's just the wild, wild west. Do whatever you want. And then no one cleans up after this mess at the end of the semester or at the end of the year. So these systems are a lot of systems go up, and a lot of them are orphaned over time. We think that's one of the major indicators why education, at least as that particular type, has so many assets relative to its industry peers. Technology, this should go without saying. Technology companies where you're talking Facebook, Amazon, Google, they put a ginormous number of systems online, if nothing else, but for scale. It's a huge, huge number. So this stands to reason. But then you have smaller ones like gaming companies that only have a couple of thousand assets in general, in the median. Some of the things that we'll go into these numbers is how many brands are they protecting? How many subsidiaries do they have? How do they do marketing? Because the more you do marketing promotions, the more assets you litter out there onto the internet. But this gives us an idea. So as you're listening to this presentation, what other metrics could we give ourselves? What other questions could we ask of the data to start narrowing in on how much of these education assets matter, or the technology ones? What more is there to learn here? Why are these numbers the way they are? What are the interesting factors on it? Next, let's look at domain names. Domain names, again, foo.com, bar.com, different top 10 companies, US companies, will register a differing amount of domain names. Most of them, as we can see here, is over 100, but no more than 1,000 in most cases, except for gaming. In the case of the banking industry, they seem to so far have the most in terms of median number of unique domain names. We think that's because they register a lot of domain names to prevent against phishing. You know, phishing, typo squatting attacks do expand the number of registrations that they have. So it's not so much the number of assets that get varied, because a lot of times they just park these domain names. We think they just register a lot because they're attacked with phishing a lot. Versus education, they don't get phished a lot, at least relative to banks. So they wouldn't need as many registered domain names. They might register one for different school departments, different universities, different projects and things like that. But they're not going to need a ginormous number of domain names like maybe a retailer or a hotel. When it comes to retail and hotels, we noticed a lot of domain name registrations for marketing promotions, you know, whatever they happen to be, you know, different countries, different regions, you know, different sale items on different holidays, and they'll register brand new domain names for brand new promotions every single year, and the number will go up and up. What we found interesting in the gaming or the video gaming region is when a top publisher has a game out there, relative to other industry peers, they just didn't need a whole lot of domain names. They'll have one for World of Warcraft or what are the ones, Overwatch and then games like that. They didn't need a lot of them. And they don't seem to get phished nearly as often as their other peers, let's say in retail, hotels, or banking. But again, we're only guessing here. We think these are valid guesses, valid theories, but if there's others that have different theories that we might be able to test out and look deeper in the data, send it our way because we're happy to have a look. Here's another one. This is the median percentage of internet accessible and cloud-based assets with each major industry. So if you looked at all their externally available assets, what percentage of them are actually hosted in the cloud? And when we mean by the cloud, we're meaning Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google App Engine, and others, the well-known cloud providers. So if you look real closely, this is where it gets interesting. The vast majority of the internet accessible inventory of these top companies are not in the cloud. So despite all the hype and all the hoopla around companies are moving to the cloud, you have to actually look a little bit deeper into the numbers, because when you say moving to the cloud, we have to ask another question. Do you mean cloud hosted? Do you mean platform as a service? Do you mean infrastructure as a service, or software as a service? When it comes to hosting, most organizations are still hosting themselves, but probably because moving to the cloud for many of their assets just doesn't make sense. They don't need the scalability of the cloud. They'll host it themselves. So when it comes to cloud adoption, when it comes to hosting, the cloud providers have a lot of greenfield territory. There's a lot more room to grow. So all major companies have leveraged the cloud to some extent, but the penetration into their environment is not as big as anybody might believe. They'll be using Dropbox and Box and Gmail and things like that, but they're not necessarily hosting all their assets on a cloud provider. Next is CDN. This is a very similar metric to the one we just saw in cloud providers. What percentage of their assets, the externally accessible assets, are behind or hosted from or through, I should say, a CDN provider? A CDN would be Akamai, Cloudflare, Fastly, and others. And you can see most industries, it's a very tiny percentage where their internet accessible assets are hosted through a CDN. Why do you use a CDN? And for those that are all familiar with what a content delivery network is, it's 100% about speed, where milliseconds matter. I go to a website and it needs to be as fast as possible, which means the data and the return data or the return route should be as close to the user as possible. So a top 10 US automaker or a top 10 bank, only 2 to 3% of their publicly facing assets are using a CDN. But this is very different when we're talking about, let's say, hotels or healthcare. Healthcare, they don't really, only 1% or so are behind a CDN, probably for security reasons, not so much performance. Because why? Because they don't, the average healthcare website probably doesn't receive a whole lot of load. Neither does a gaming website or a banking website. They get some load, but not anywhere near, I should say, their main websites might get a lot of traffic, but everything else, probably not. Versus hotels. Hotels was the standout at 10%. we think a vast majority of hotel websites, milliseconds matter, because if you don't convert a new customer that visits to a website within a few seconds, they're gone and off to the next provider to get to book a hotel room there. Secondly, in the search engine rankings, we believe Google and Bing give preference to locally sourced data. So if the CDN is sending a signal to the search engine that says the data is local and it's fast, they're going to raise higher up in the rankings, which is of benefit to the hotels. So that's why we think hotels have a higher usage rates of CDNs versus really anybody else. Again, we could be wrong, but we're thinking that's what's going on here. Next, we're going to have a look at certificate authorities. These are the straight up TLS certificate authorities. So when you look at, let's say, a top 10 US retailer, you look at their entire inventory and all the assets that are using TLS, that support TLS, how many total CAs do they have? Now, going into this, I would have said, yeah, maybe a top 10 retailer, any top 10 company, they would probably have 5, 10 or so. I was way off. They have usually, somewhere between 30, 50, sometimes even 100 CAs across the range. There could be a couple of reasons for this. One is it's indicated by how many total asset the company has. It's also modified by what percentage of their inventory supports TLS to begin with. So you might have a ton of assets, but if you really don't support TLS, you're therefore not going to have a whole lot of different certificate authorities. So that's one indication why these numbers might be what they are. But also because different subsidiaries, different groups, different departments will have different go-to TLS providers. So they're not just using one or two. It seems like each group or unit or team within a company is allowed to use their own TLS certificates. And for whatever reason, in an IT operations environment, it's been perfectly difficult to centralize between one small handful of CAs. Secondly, CAs, now TLS certificates, when they expire, the browsers will blacklist you instantly now, for security reasons. So now companies are doing two things. One is when you support TLS, you go up higher in the search engine ranks. So more people are having TLS certificates, but then you're trying to re-up them all the time. And once you re-up them, you probably don't want to switch TLS certificates. So we think that has something to do with the explosion of the numbers. But somebody in a more of an IT operations role might have a better indication than I do. Next one we'll go over is expired TLS certificates. As I mentioned, when a TLS certificate expires, usually you get blocked by the modern browsers these days. So this is, on the median, that if you say for a top 10 US hotel operator, you'll see about 147 systems that have expired TLS certs. For healthcare, it's about 500. For retail, it's 436. Now, these numbers can be a bit deceptive because they are influenced by the number of TLS supporting assets in general. Meaning, if you really don't support TLS across your enterprise, you're really not going to have expired TLS certificates. So it was interesting that education, just on its own, it looks like it's really high at 1,600 or so expired TLS certificates. But when you take into consideration they have 140,000 or so assets to look after, the percentage isn't very high. But these numbers are worth looking at because this is the cleanup that IT ops has to do and security ops has to do. We have to clean up these certificates if we care about these assets at all to begin with. Perhaps many of them should just be retired. One other thing I wanted to point out is on the hotel industry, because hotels are so dependent upon search engine rankings, they have to keep their overall numbers low because you can't have a certificate expire, your website get turned off because you won't get customers and user conversion. So these numbers have to be extraordinarily low, which is not necessarily the case in technology. Again, technology also has about 140,000 or so assets when you look at the average company. So again, you have to play with these numbers in terms of percentages relative to the number of assets and the number of TLS supporting assets they have in general. Next, I want to go over the countries that are hosting assets. Now, many of these top US companies, they're hosting all over the world. They have to serve a global audience to some respect. And this lends itself to security because information security is not just a technical exercise, it's also a law and regulatory exercise. So we have to be aware of the different laws and regulations in different countries. And we can't do that unless we know where these systems or these assets are being hosted in. So if you look at, let's say, a healthcare operator, a top 10 US healthcare provider, they're hosting in about 14 different countries. Hotels are about 24, technology is about 30. And if you look close, this tends to make sense. A technology company serves a very global audience, so they want to start hosting for speed reasons in each and every geo, which has a side effect of they have to now be regulated by many different regulations in whatever country that they're operating in. Hotels 24. Hotels, these are giant mega brands with international customers, so they have to have a whole lot of international presence. Not so much in the same in retail or gaming or even education. If you're in a top 10 public university in the US, you probably don't need to host in too many countries, maybe just data sharing arrangements. Maybe you have a few projects here and there, but not a whole lot of penetration across the entire enterprise environment. And the last piece of data I wanted to go over is private IP space. There's many reasons why this happens, and these numbers are very volatile. What this means is if we have a host name, foo.bar.com, and we ping DNS and get a resolution, these numbers resolve to RFC 19 internal address space. So we can't reach out and directly connect to these assets, but we know these assets are resolving to something internal, which means we know they're there, which means we know there's a mistake in DNS resolution that was made in some way. Internal assets that should not be exposed to the internet are being leaked out. These numbers have a lot to do with IT hygiene and the overall number of assets. And I should add one more, and the change rate of the network environment. So these numbers here, whatever they are, if we measure these the next month, they'd be all different. These are just changes being made all the time. But one thing that we do know is internal assets, those that we shouldn't know about externally, that we shouldn't be able to connect to externally, are somehow being leaked out to the internet, usually because of split horizon DNS. A lot of times the DNS system is not just hosting internal or just external, it's hosting both at the same time, and these are leaking out. All right, so we've gone through some numbers, we got a lot of what, and the next thing I want to go through is some advice on how we can use asset inventory to make ourselves a little bit more secure over the things that we've done in vulnerability management, in the past. This set of numbers that I've given you is just the start of what we're going to start giving out there to the community. Our next set of data is going to be, we're going to start narrowing in on particular industries. We're going to look at the set of the top 10 companies specifically that make up each industry and see what we can learn, see how different companies are from one another. So that's what's coming next. But for now, I want to finish up by saying some advice. I'll give you some takeaways rather than just give you a whole bunch of data. What can we do to protect ourselves? One, and this is very easy, everybody will agree to this, ensure that all your company assets are being scanned for vulnerabilities. Not just the ones you know of, not just the important ones, all of them. Because what we do know is an adversary, they'll go after the important ones if they can break in, they will. But if they're pushed off, they will go after the second or tertiary tier. And a lot of times it's not so much the most important asset that got you hacked, it's the one that you forgot about or didn't know you have, that the adversary was able to worm into your network through an unimportant asset, right back to Equifax. Secondly, vulnerability management doesn't always scan for all vulnerabilities, let's say, such as domain takeovers or WordPress plugins. The network scanners and the web application dash scanners, they usually don't scan for WordPress plugins. That's separate. They also don't scan for vulnerabilities in out-of-scope assets like IoT devices and things like that. They're just, let's say an application scanner, there are like a dash scanner. They're not going to scan the web interface in an IoT device or a blog, not necessarily. They're going to be thought That's not so important. While that might be true in one sense, the adversary is not going to care. So we want to make sure that we look at everything that's in scope, the full attack surface, because the one spot you don't focus on is the one spot the adversary will break in. Next, look for assets with potentially internal names. So we often find that we find host names with the word dev, staging, internal, admin, test, things like that, where you're experimenting with new code, you're launching a new project, you want to see if it works or it doesn't work, and they're not necessarily secure, no one's supposed to know about them. Well, we're seeing them, and we're seeing them not being very secure. They might be testing. If you're going to stand up and test them, then quickly decommission them. But a lot of times these systems are out there waiting to be exploited all the time for just someone to look around. 4, closely monitor for new domain name registrations, including those with international TLDs. Get with your domain admin and try to get a feed of newly registered domain names, because all of a sudden marketing will launch a brand new domain name, someone will add a brand new host name, and all of a sudden you had a new asset deployed that may or may not have vulnerabilities that IT or IT security had no knowledge or existence of. A way to front end that is just knowing new domain names that are registered by the company. And finally, number 5, this is like right back to InfoSec 101, but it's, you know, the basics are important, and often enough, the basics aren't done. So perform at least weekly scans for newly deployed assets listing on risky ports. Let's just take some easy ones. 21, the NetBIOS ports 137 and 138. And then you have 3306 and 3389, which are MySQL and RDP respectively. This is how 10, 20, 30% of compromises are happening. Forgotten assets that have an exposed MySQL port or exposed RDP port, that if you're just doing basic stuff, scanning your ranges, scanning your host names, scanning your domain names, making sure you know what's out there, you'll save yourself a lot of pain and suffering on the most easy things. Security doesn't necessarily need to be hard. You don't need to break in with the most elite vulnerabilities. Often enough, just cleaning up the easy stuff will cause your adversary to go elsewhere. Those 5 steps, in my experience and the experience of many others, will save you a lot of heartache, and they're not very hard to do. These are the things we must focus on. So with that being said, Richard, we can take some questions if we have them, or people can hit me up on Twitter at Jeremiah G, ask me some questions about the data there. And I am all ears on data requests. I'm sitting on copies of the internet, and I'm willing to share.
Yeah, we have a few questions, Jeremiah. If we do not list an asset for an insurance company, will they still pay out if that asset is compromised?
That's a really good question. I think you're going to want to check with your policy, check with your broker, and check with your carrier. My indication is, from my experience, and as far as that goes, is generally yes, because during the process of getting a quote, they probably didn't ask you for your ranges of IP addresses to begin with. If you're a very, very large risk, a very, very large enterprise, they might ask you for some information, but I think generally it would still cover it, even though you didn't list the asset, because no one knows all their assets just yet.
Gotcha. We have another one. We noticed that you did not list a category for government. Was there a particular reason, or was it insignificant numbers?
That's a good question. At least when it came to, let's say, the federal government, it's difficult for us to draw circles around different departments in an easy fashion. So we might have a look at that. We might be able to do it for, state versus state, but we have to figure out a way to go, how do we draw a circle around one particular department, like Department of Education versus another department? Then we might be able to do it. We just have to figure out how to model ownership from one department to the next, since a lot of times they cross.
Gotcha. I'm not sure if this is a tongue-in-cheek question or not, but will you be spinning off another company to dive deeper into validating the conjectures you've made to explain your numbers?
I don't think so. I think I'm really enjoying working with this data because it becomes useful to many other companies, becomes useful to M&A providers, hedge fund managers, cyber insurance providers, pen testers. We've been operating a little blindly in information security. We really haven't known what it is that we're protecting. So if I can give a little bit of insight to a lot of different people, that's how I'm going to make an impact. But bit discovery is where I'm at. I can really only do one company at a time.
Okay. So I think everyone realizes that the new wild, wild west is IoT. So how can we get a handle on these? And because they're popping up all over the place in every company.
I think it's going to be a two-part problem, and that's a good question. And the answer is anything but simple. One is, if we have an IoT problem, where are the IoT devices, at least the ones that are externally facing, that are going to cause us grief? We're not always going to know all the vulnerabilities in them. So two is, well, first is find them. What are they vulnerable to the extent that we can? When they're vulnerable, how do we fix them? And that's not always easy. And probably the last one is, when they're compromised, how do we know? So I think what I would do is I would first figure out, to the extent that I had them, and then I would try to draw a network circle around them and go, okay, these are the ITO devices that I have to use, that I have to deploy. They're going to get hacked. When they're hacked, can I isolate the environment to a particular network segment? So at least I'm the first to know when they're hacked, and I can isolate the damage. I think that's probably the best we're going to do.
Okay. Then the most important question, which I have for you, I have one. When COVID-19 eventually gets under control, and I'm sure all of us are really waiting for that day to come. It won't be one day, it'll be spread over several months as people test the waters. But we'd love to have you come out to LA again. In person.
If you invite me, I will show up. I knew you were going to ask me that. I knew you were going to put me on the spot. But I always like the LA OWASP chapters and the ISSA chapters. Great bunch of people. Always like, as much as I teach them, they teach me. So I'm always looking to meet new people, have new ideas, new experiences, new problems. Show me new problems that are really important and difficult to solve. You don't have to have the answer to everything. Usually it's enough just to identify one problem that's worth solving.
Oh, great. So you're the data meister. And we really appreciate you sharing this information for us. For a lot of people, it's the forgotten important stuff, right? They're busy doing all this other stuff, but how can you protect what you don't know that you have? I mean, that's the basic question. So listen, really want to thank you. Hope all is well out there where you are. And I hope everyone has learned a lot from this. Thanks for those questions. And Jeremiah, really appreciate it. You stay well, my friend.
Thanks so much, Richard. Appreciate it.
Okay.